He was not one of us, but he came to us as a baby and lived among us. He looked like us, but he was more powerful. He did things that no one had ever done. He came to help us, to deliver us from evil. Who am I talking about? Church people. Let me give you some more details. He was born on the planet Krypton. He came to us on a spaceship and his home planet exploded. He was adopted by human parents. He had special powers and powers that made him into a hero. Who am I really talking about? See, if we only get part of the story, part of the journey, part of the tale, we're going to leave out some missing pieces. And what we do with our brains, we're naturally wired to do this, we actually fill in the details ourselves, or we assume we know things that we don't. While Jesus and Superman have some similarities, they are not the same person. The story of Jesus is much bigger, deeper, richer, mysterious than just a few shepherds, some wise men, and a baby born in a manger. Welcome to our series that I'm calling The Incarnation. Now, I must confess, when I thought about doing a series on this subject, I had no idea what I was in for. I bought a couple books, thinking, they always help me out. Of course, these books were both written on a very deep theological and philosophical level. Sometimes when I get a book for a sermon series and I start reading the book and I think, wow, this will preach. I did not get that feeling when I read these books. It was more like, how am I going to explain one of the biggest mysteries of the Christian faith? And half the stuff in this book I don't even understand. But I'm going to try. So now every hero has an origin story, right? If you watch all the hero movies, that's the first movie, the origin story. Origins are important. They tell us about our hero, who he is, what he does, how he does what he does, or she. Most of us would logically turn to Matthew and Luke for the origin of our hero story this time of year. But that would only give you part of the story. It would provide you just a few of the pieces of information you should know. Now, I know Jesus, the human being, was born in a manger, but Jesus was around much before that, much longer. And while God doesn't truly have an origin story because he's God, we do go back to the beginning. And I want to encourage you as I talk today not to jump ahead in what you already know about the story, what the scriptures already told us down the road about God. Take this one step at a time. Erase all the things that are New Testament and all the things that we haven't talked about. So let's begin. Genesis 1:26. It says, "Then God said, 'Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, that they may rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, over the livestock, over the wild animals, over all the creatures that move along the ground.'" See, most of the time when we talk about that verse, we're talking about who we are, right? And in some sense, our value. Hey, we're made in God's image, and we have kind of leadership over this earth. But I want to talk about the first 6 words today. First of all, first 3 words, "Then God said." So when you read that, you think God, that's a being, that's one, that's singular. But then God says, "Let us make." Us is a plural word. Again, we know the rest of the story. We know that we believe in a triune God, in other words, the Trinity. But that's now. That's not back then. That's not who the early people of the Bible knew God to be. The ancient Mid-Easterners believed in many gods back then, gods of all different kinds. They worshipped, and sometimes they would kind of like, well, I'll pray to this one and this one just to cover my bases, right? It didn't hurt to pray to more. But God's message could not be misleading to his people. And he would say things throughout the Old Testament to claim that he alone was God. Isaiah 44:6 is a good example of this. This is what the Lord says, Israel's King and Redeemer, the Lord Almighty, I am the first and I am the last. Apart from me, there is no God. God was and is the only God. Now, at the time, in those early days of Israel's nation, God had no real agenda to teach them all the nuances about himself. Because he wanted to make sure that they understood he was one. Now, the first thing that these people learned about God, and really naturally, understandably learned, that he was transcendent. He was above us. He was beyond us. He was bigger than us, right? While man was made in his image, they were not gods, not even close. And when mankind sinned, the difference between the two even became greater, more pronounced. So for many people in the world, today even, end of story. God made us. God transcends us. That's it. They don't believe in any other important things about God. He started it all, and he's somewhere out there doing something, maybe. Now, before we go on, I want to tell you two of the things that we must know about God. But they're not really so much about what God does, they are about who he is, and that's important to note. God is love, and God is holy. God doesn't choose when to be loving and when to be holy. He is both. And he is both all the time. It's just who he is. When the Bible talks about God is love or God is holiness, it's like you can't separate the action. It is just who he is. So what does a transcendent God do who is both loving and holy when his beloved creatures rebel against him? Well, God wanted to be with his people. He wanted to help his people. So God chose ways to become immanent, which means to remain or within or to dwell, indwell. Okay, this is getting complicated, right? This is why these books start to make my mind hurt. So we have a God who's transcendent, who is also immanent, or at least becomes immanent on occasion. Let me give you some examples here. I'm going to give you a few from scriptures. Genesis 18, the Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw three men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. Moving on later, Genesis 32, so Jacob was left alone. A man wrestled with him until daybreak. And when the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Moving on to Exodus, very next book. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. And then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And at this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Finally, I just got one more example. 1 Samuel, again, pretty early Old Testament still. The Lord came and stood there, calling as at the other time, Samuel, Samuel. And then Samuel said, speak, for your servant is listening. And the list goes on and on and on and on. See, this doesn't start in the New Testament. It starts in the Old. God continually reaching out to his people, continually becoming immanent in some way to guide, at times to scold, at times to even punish, but most clearly to guide and love his people. God would use different means to become immanent. Angels, dreams, maybe just showing up himself. So when we talk about God becoming incarnate, well, there is a sense in which the New Testament is different. But in a sense, he did, to a degree, become incarnate in the Old. God used different means. I want to highlight some of them in the Old Testament. God offered covenants. You know, when both parties agree on something, they make kind of a promise to each other. That's a covenant. And God promised that he would be immanent with his people as long as they followed the guidelines, followed the rules, followed the commandments, and I will be with you. But God's people didn't always do that. They either didn't follow the law or they kept figuring out a way to follow the law without the heart of the law. Right? They couldn't hold up their end of their bargain. Another thing that God did to become immanent was he offered to dwell with them in a tabernacle, in a temple, as they journeyed or even when they established their city. We studied some of this not too long ago when we discussed the prophets near the end of the Old Testament. Malachi says this. I said this in Malachi. God is telling them, you go through the motions, but you don't fear me. You don't respect me. And God won't respect worship that doesn't come from the heart. You can't go through the motions and expect God to be okay with that. You know, I feel like I'm going to start doing that more often. I'm going to quote myself. It kind of builds up my ego. You know, Pastor Dan once said, one of the most interesting things, one of the topics that focuses on is the pre-incarnate Jesus. We think of Jesus being New Testament, but we shouldn't alone think about New Testament. And this is kind of, again, it makes your brain hurt. Pre-incarnate Jesus? What are we talking about here? When we think of Jesus, we think of a 30-year-old-ish Jewish man, right? Big beard, skinny. But we shouldn't always necessarily think of Jesus in that manner, especially not in the Old Testament. Jesus wasn't incarnate as a human being then. Now, some scholars debated whether maybe he kind of did show up once in a while in the Old Testament. Was he one of the three men that appeared to Abraham? Was Jesus the man that wrestled with Jacob? Naturally, when we think of God in human form, we naturally think of Jesus. But Jesus wasn't human, not back then. Certainly the Jewish people at that time didn't think of God in that way. They would never have thought to think of God being human. Absurd. Now we do know that Jacob did wrestle with God in human form in some way or another. Maybe it was Jesus. But our brains tend to go there a little bit more quickly than they should. And certainly not the Jewish people. They would never put that together. But God kept reaching out to his people, and his plan was to bless the whole world through him. Through all the difficult parts of the Bible that you said, ooh, God did that. Ultimately, his goal was to bless the world through his people. And he did so, and he provided priests, and he provided kings, and he provided prophets. Priests who spoke to God on the people's behalf. Prophets who spoke to the people on God's behalf. Kings who led the people of God as a nation. Okay, that's pretty broad stroke definitions of all those, but I'll hold by those. But God continued to go throughout the history, through thousands of years of reaching out to his people. He would not let them go. even when they ran the other way. He used different ways to become immanent with his people, even as he was transcendent. And he gave them hope that one day a Messiah would be coming. In fact, the last chapter of the last book of the Old Testament says this, and we studied this earlier. See, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before the great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the parents to their children, the hearts of their children to their parents, or else I will come and strike the land with total destruction. Again, I love the paradox there. Both great and dreadful day of the Lord, maybe depending on who you are. They held on to this hope that God would one day set the world right. But not in the way that God actually did it. See, as author Graham Cole states, they expected God to come as himself. Why wouldn't they think that? God becoming a baby, becoming a man? How absurd. How ridiculous. Tell me, I'm going to read Psalms 96, 11 through 13. Tell me if you think this leads toward the little baby in a manger. Let the heavens rejoice. Let the earth be glad. Let the sea resound and all that is in it. Let the fields be jubilant and everything in them. Let all the trees of the forest sing for joy. Let all creation rejoice because the Lord, for he comes. He comes to judge the earth. He will judge the world in righteousness and the people in his faithfulness. Now, ultimately, we know some of this is in the second coming, right? But they didn't know. This was the expectation of the people at that point. When God comes, he's going to come in all his glory. My friends, we talk about the incarnation. We're talking about something so unexpected, so unbelievable, so mysterious. God? Baby? Human baby? We're not talking about just Son of God. We're talking about God himself. Worship team, you can make your way forward. The triune God was there at the beginning. Jesus was there at the beginning. People knew him and worshiped him as the one true God. A God of love, a God who is love and who is holiness. A God who is transcendent, but yet continually being immanent with his people. He did this because he cared too much for his prized creation, man and woman, to leave them in the darkness. So God reaches out over and over and over again. And he would promise them a Messiah, one who would put things right again. But they expected him to come in all of his glory. They didn't expect him to come in the form of a man. They didn't expect him to come in the form of a Superman. And they certainly didn't expect him to come in the form of a God-man. But he did. It's exactly what he did. And we should regain the marvel and mystery of what that means. God, man, somehow, the mystery of how they could be formed together. It's beyond understanding, and yet, too wonderful not to at least try to understand.